November 14, 1942, Iron Bottom Sound, off Guadalcanal. The night was alive with fire. Rain fell in sheets, glowing orange under the flash of naval guns. The sea convulsed as shells the size of small cars roared through the darkness, each one leaving a glowing arc before vanishing into the black horizon. Aboard the battleship USS South Dakota, BB-57, every deck trembled under the recoil of her 16-inch Mark 6 guns. The concussion shattered the calm of the Pacific, a rolling thunder that tore through the night and into the hearts of men miles away. Through the haze of cordite, radar screens flickered. Orders came sharp and cold. Fire full broadside. 8 barrels erupted in unison, hurling steel at over 2,000 feet per second. The Japanese task force, advancing unseen through rain and smoke, suddenly found itself under a storm of invisible death. For seconds, the ocean turned white, columns of water and flame rising where destroyers once sailed. The Japanese attack faltered. And in that instant, the balance of fear shifted. That thunderous moment was when South Dakota announced her arrival to history. The echoes of that night would linger long after the guns fell silent. But to understand how the South Dakota came to unleash such fury and why her salvos broke not just ships, but morale itself, we must return to the turbulent months before Guadalcanal, when the Pacific was still dominated by the rising sun. The Pacific in 1942 was a battleground without mercy. Just months earlier, the world had watched the rising sun blaze across Asia and the Pacific Ocean. Japan's forces, disciplined and relentless, swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, carving an empire from the sea. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sinking battleships, destroying aircraft, and shaking American confidence to its core. In the first half of 1942, Japanese naval power seemed unstoppable. Their carriers roamed freely, their cruisers and destroyers striking with unmatched precision. Every island chain became a forward base for further conquest. Yet beneath the devastation, the United States began to rebuild rapidly, quietly, and with purpose. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts glowed through the night, hammers ringing on steel hulls that would soon carry vengeance across the ocean. Among these new warships was a vessel unlike any the world had seen, USS South Dakota, BB-57. Laid down in July 1939 and commissioned in March 1942, she represented a new class of American battleship, compact, heavily armored, and devastatingly armed. Where older dreadnoughts had been large and slow, South Dakota was engineered for modern war. Shorter in length for tighter maneuvering, faster, and equipped with a radar system that turned darkness into daylight. Her heart was steel and fire, 9 16-inch 45 caliber guns, each capable of launching a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell over 20 miles. Her armor belt, up to 12 inches thick, could shrug off most naval gunfire, and beneath her decks ran a complex nervous system of radars, fire control computers, and communication networks, a technological marvel in an age still adjusting to electronic warfare. To the sailors who served aboard her, South Dakota felt invincible, a floating fortress. But they also knew the Pacific was littered with the grave of ships once thought unsinkable. The Japanese Navy, battle-hardened and tactically sharp, had humiliated larger fleets before. Their night-fighting ability, long-range torpedoes, and disciplined gunnery had no equal. As 1942 dragged on, the tides began to shift, not through luck, but through desperate endurance. The U.S. victories at Coral Sea and Midway blunted Japan's carrier supremacy, but the Imperial Navy still held dominance in surface engagements. Japan's destroyers and cruisers prowled the Solomon Islands, sinking supply ships and annihilating isolated American units. It was in this brutal environment that the South Dakota was sent into action, her first real test under fire. She sailed into the Pacific alongside veteran ships of the line, part of an American resurgence that was learning fast how to fight the Japanese on equal terms. Her mission was clear: protect the fragile toehold the U.S. had gained on the island of Guadalcanal, a strip of jungle and coral whose fate would decide the future of the Pacific War. The men aboard South Dakota did not yet know that the battles awaiting them would become some of the most chaotic and violent naval clashes in history. But as the ship steamed toward the Solomon Islands, her crew drilled relentlessly, gunnery practice, damage control, radar plotting. Every man knew his station, every alarm bell his cue. The calm before battle was the silence of precision. Because in the coming nights, amid the black waters of Iron-Bottom Sound, South Dakota would meet her proving ground, and the legend of her guns would be written in fire. By mid-1942, Guadalcanal had become the fulcrum on which the Pacific War balanced. The island, part of the Solomons chain, offered control of vital sea routes between the United States and Australia. For Japan, it was a springboard to threaten Allied supply lines. For America, it was a foothold to halt the enemy's expansion, the first step toward reclaiming the Pacific. When U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they seized the unfinished Japanese airfield later named Henderson Field. The move shocked Tokyo and forced Japan into a costly struggle to retake it. For months, the two sides fought on land, in the air, and at sea, a grinding battle of attrition known as the Guadalcanal Campaign. Each night, the Japanese Tokyo Express, fast destroyer convoys, raced down the slot to bombard American positions and deliver reinforcements. The seas around the island became a killing ground, littered with burning ships. The U.S. Navy suffered heavy losses in earlier engagements. Salvo Island, Cape Esperance, Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, names etched in blood and oil. In November 1942, the situation reached its breaking point. Japan prepared a massive effort to land troops and supplies to finally overwhelm the Marines. To stop them, Admiral William F. Halsey dispatched every available surface ship. Among them were the battleships USS Washington, BB-56, and USS South Dakota, BB-57, under Admiral Willis A. Lee, forming the core of Task Force 64. They steamed into the night like silent giants, radar-guided, disciplined, and determined. Yet they faced an enemy equally fierce. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's fleet, including the battlecruiser Kirishima, heavy cruisers, and destroyers, all seasoned veterans of earlier victories. The two forces would collide under the cover of darkness in the narrow, treacherous waters off Guadalcanal, a place sailors would later call Iron-Bottom Sound for the ships resting on its floor. As South Dakota's lookouts scanned the horizon, the crew could feel the tension in the air. Radar pings echoed softly from the plotting rooms. Guns were loaded. The night was thick with tropical heat and anticipation. No one aboard could have known that within hours they would fight one of the most ferocious close-range battles of the entire war, and that South Dakota's thunder would echo across the Pacific, forever changing the course of the campaign. And so, as midnight approached and the Japanese fleet advanced unseen, the stage was set for the clash that would test every weapon, every man, and every nerve aboard the South Dakota. Next came the moment of confrontation, the night when radar met instinct and steel met fire. Life aboard the USS South Dakota in 1942 was a balance of monotony and tension, endless drills interrupted by moments of raw, electric fear. The men were young, many had never seen combat before the Pacific. Their days began before sunrise, with the metallic clang of boots on steel decks and the low hum of machinery echoing through the hull. Every sound, every vibration was part of their world. They slept in cramped quarters, stacked 3 bunks high, the air thick with the scent of oil, salt, and sweat. Meals were short, strong coffee, powdered eggs, and a constant background rumble of the ship's engines. Even in rest, the men were never far from battle. Every sailor knew his station by heart. In an emergency, they could reach their posts in seconds, guided by instinct and repetition. Fear was constant, but so was discipline. Veterans of Pearl Harbor had drilled into them the importance of readiness. They lived with the knowledge that a single shell or torpedo could erase their world in an instant. Yet, when the alarm bell rang and the ship slipped into battle stations, the fear hardened into focus. On South Dakota, courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was control over it. Amid this human endurance lay the machine itself, a marvel of American engineering. South Dakota was one of the most powerful warships afloat, a compact battleship designed under treaty restrictions that demanded strength without excess. Her hull was layered with armor thicker than the width of a man's chest, her internal compartments divided for damage control, and her gun turrets massive steel fortresses unto themselves. At her heart were 9 16-inch 45 caliber Mark VI guns, mounted in 3 triple turrets. Each barrel was nearly 50 feet long, firing shells that could pierce 18 inches of armor at 20,000 yards. When fired, the shockwave rolled across the sea like an earthquake. The gunners wore cotton in their ears and braced themselves against the concussion. Inside the turrets, temperatures soared as hydraulic systems roared and loaders worked with mechanical rhythm: shell, powder, ram, fire. Supporting those great guns was technology still new to naval warfare: radar. The Mark VIII fire control radar, mounted atop the ship's superstructure, could detect enemy ships in total darkness or through thick clouds of smoke. It allowed South Dakota to track and engage targets long before the enemy could see her. The ship's crew trusted this new, invisible eye completely, though few fully understood its complexity. The armor, too, was revolutionary. Instead of the broad, exposed hulls of pre-war battleships, South Dakota's vital sections were enclosed in a compact citadel, layers of hardened steel protecting magazines, engines, and command centers. She could take punishment that would cripple lesser ships, and her crew knew it. That confidence was a weapon in itself. Yet on the other side of the ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy still held a powerful reputation. Their sailors had honed their craft for years, mastering night combat in the waters of the Pacific. Japanese captains trained for aggressive, close-range engagements, relying on sharp eyesight, discipline, and instinct. They considered radar unreliable, a Western gimmick that dulled a sailor's natural senses. At night, Japanese ships operated with deadly precision. Their lookouts could identify silhouettes at astonishing distances. Their long-lance torpedoes, powered by pure oxygen, were fast, long-ranged, and lethal. For the first year of the war, these weapons dominated the night seas. American cruisers and destroyers fell prey to unseen attacks, their hulls ripped apart before they could even spot the enemy. The Japanese believed this mastery of night fighting was their ace, an advantage no enemy could match. And for a time, it was true. They struck fast, disappeared into darkness, and reappeared victorious. Their confidence bordered on invincibility. To many Japanese officers, the American Navy was clumsy, overly reliant on machines, and lacking the spirit to fight in close quarters. But technology and training were beginning to shift that balance. The Americans had studied their defeats, learning at a pace that surprised even their allies. Radar, which the Japanese dismissed, was quietly transforming the nature of naval combat. For the first time, ships could see through the night, plot enemy movements, and coordinate fire without ever exposing themselves. As South Dakota steamed toward Guadalcanal, these two philosophies of war, instinct versus electronics, experience versus innovation, were about to collide. In the calm before the storm, some of the crew gathered on deck to watch the sun dip behind the horizon. The Pacific sky turned crimson, and the men spoke in quiet tones about the battle ahead. They had heard stories of Japanese destroyers slipping like ghosts through the night, of American ships vanishing beneath walls of fire. No one admitted fear aloud, but it hung in the air like mist. Below deck, gunners checked their loading systems one last time. Engineers monitored the boilers, listening for any irregular pulse in the machinery. In the plotting rooms, radar operators stared at glowing screens, adjusting knobs, their faces ghostly under the dim light. Every man on board felt the weight of what was coming, the confrontation between two naval worlds. The Japanese were confident, perhaps too confident, believing their night vision and torpedoes would once again dictate the outcome. The Americans, now armed with radar and raw determination, were prepared to prove otherwise. And at the center of that collision stood South Dakota, her decks humming with energy, her guns ready, her crew steady. She was no longer just a battleship. She was the embodiment of America's industrial might and human resilience. The stage was set not merely for a clash of ships, but for a clash of ideas, one built on instinct and tradition, the other on technology and precision. And soon, both would meet in the blinding chaos of battle, where theory would burn away in the flash of gunfire. Admiral Willis A. Lee, commanding Task Force 64, was a man perfectly suited to this moment in history. Calm, deliberate and analytical, he was not the kind of leader who shouted orders or sought glory. His crew called him Ching, a nickname from his Naval Academy days, and those who served under him respected his quiet authority. Lee understood radar like few others in the Navy. Long before the war, he had studied its potential, believing it could revolutionize naval gunnery. Now, with South Dakota and Washington under his command, he had the opportunity to prove it in combat. His plan was simple yet daring: use radar to detect the enemy before they could react, then unleash the battleships, heavy guns at ranges where the Japanese wouldn't expect them. As night descended over Iron Bottom Sound, Lee's formation advanced with discipline. Every ship maintained radio silence, relying on radar bearings and preset maneuvers. In the plotting rooms, operators tracked faint blips, distant echoes of Japanese ships moving in the black void. The data flowed to Lee's command center, where decisions were made in seconds. The Japanese, unaware of the Americans' exact position, pressed on with confidence. Their destroyers fanned out in attack formation, preparing for another textbook night assault. They expected surprise, they always did, but this time it would be different. Radar-fed firing solutions gave the Americans the advantage of sight without sight. Targets appeared as coordinates rather than silhouettes. Lee's officers translated those numbers into range, bearing, and elevation. Fire control computers whirred. The order was simple, quiet, and absolute: open fire when ready. When the South Dakota's guns erupted, the night turned to day. Shockwaves tore through the sea. Japanese commanders, unprepared for such accuracy and range in darkness, were stunned. Their formations broke apart under the first salvos. This was the beginning of a new kind of warfare: mechanical precision, overwhelming human intuition. The South Dakota's fire didn't just destroy ships, it shattered the very confidence of the Japanese Navy. Their mastery of night combat was suddenly obsolete. In the glow of burning vessels, Admiral Lee remained composed. He had trusted the technology, his crew, and the ship, and in doing so, he had rewritten the doctrine of naval battle. But the night was far from over. The Japanese still fought with ferocity, their shells finding the South Dakota's armor again and again. The ship's lights flickered, circuits failed, yet her guns kept roaring. What followed next was chaos: steel against steel, fire against darkness, the moment when the South Dakota stood alone under a storm of enemy fire. The climax of the battle was about to unfold, and the sea would never be the same again. November 14, 1942. Midnight over Iron Bottom Sound. The ocean was black glass beneath a sky without stars. The rain had eased, leaving behind a mist that clung to the surface, heavy, suffocating, and silent. Somewhere in that darkness, two fleets were feeling for each other like predators in the deep. Aboard USS South Dakota, the tension was absolute. Every man was at his station, eyes fixed on gauges, radars, and the shadows outside. The silence before the first shot was almost unbearable. The radar blips had grown closer, faint dots pulsing with each sweep. Admiral Lee's task force was about to meet the full strength of the Japanese counterattack. The first exchange came just after 00:00 hours. A burst of light on the horizon, followed by a thunder that rolled across the waves. Japanese destroyers opened fire, their salvos flashing in the distance like lightning. Within seconds, South Dakota's 5-inch and 14 guns responded, ripping through the night with sheets of flame. Then came the bigger guns. Her 16-inch turrets roared in unison, turning the night into a living inferno. The recoil trembled through her hull, the concussion slamming the eardrums of men deep within the ship. Each shell screamed away at nearly half a ton, vanishing into darkness toward unseen targets. The Japanese formation reeled. One destroyer, Ayanami, was hit amidships, bursting into a fireball that lit the sea for miles. But the Japanese were not running. They were closing in. Through smoke and confusion, they fired back dozens of guns blazing from different angles. South Dakota's radar picked up more contacts. Shell splashes rose like fountains around her, some dangerously close. Then, disaster struck. A shell from a Japanese cruiser hit near her superstructure, severing electrical conduits and knocking out radar systems. The lights flickered, then died. The ship was plunged into darkness. Inside, compartments filled with smoke, and men scrambled with flashlights through narrow corridors. Communication lines were down. The ship's central fire control was cut off. For minutes that felt like hours, South Dakota fought blind. Her gunners relied on instinct, firing into the night where muzzle flashes appeared. Shells slammed into her armor, 13 major hits in total, tearing through decks, disabling anti-aircraft guns, and punching holes in her superstructure. One shell ripped through her mainmast, another exploded near a gun turret, sending fragments flying through the air like razors. The bridge was hit. The concussion shattered glass and twisted steel. Smoke filled the control room. Captain Thomas Gatch was wounded but refused to leave his post. Orders were shouted through handheld radios, relayed by runners sprinting through the maze of decks. At 0025, South Dakota's silhouette was illuminated by Japanese searchlights. For a few brief minutes, she was the only visible American ship in the bay, a massive, glowing target amid the chaos. Japanese gunners poured fire into her position, believing they were hammering the last American battleship standing. Inside the ship, men braced for impact after impact. The sound of shells striking armor echoed like hammer blows from hell, but her armor held. The 12-inch belt resisted most penetrations, and damage control teams worked frantically to contain fires and restore power. The air reeked of burning paint and cordite. Despite the punishment, South Dakota refused to die. Her engines still answered the helm, her turrets still turned, and her spirit, the will of hundreds of men, burned stronger than ever. She became a shadow in the smoke, fighting alone, absorbing the fury of the Japanese fleet. The Japanese believed they were on the verge of victory. From the bridge of Kirishima, Admiral Kondo ordered his heavy guns to finish her. The battlecruiser closed the distance, ready to deliver a final, killing blow. But in doing so, he walked straight into a trap. For behind the smoke, another giant waited, unseen, silent, and ready to strike. That ship was the USS Washington, BB-56, and within minutes, she would turn the tide of the entire Pacific night. At 00:35 hours, radar aboard USS Washington picked up the advancing Japanese formation clearly. The enemy's searchlights were fixed on South Dakota, exposing their own positions in the process. Admiral Willis Lee, calm amid the chaos, studied the radar screen and saw what no Japanese admiral could: the full enemy formation, battlecruiser, cruisers, destroyers, all moving within range. Lee gave the order without hesitation: open fire. The Washington's main battery of 9 16-inch guns spoke as one. The night exploded into daylight. Muzzle flashes from her turrets seared the darkness, and the concussion rolled across the water like thunderclaps. Each shell was a 2,700-pound message of vengeance, hurled with precision, guided by radar. The Japanese ship Kirishima was caught squarely in the inferno. Within the first few salvos, massive shells tore through her armor, detonating deep within her hull. Explosions rippled from bow to stern, her decks engulfed in flame. In just 7 minutes, Kirishima was reduced to a burning wreck. Her rudder jammed, her guns silenced. The Japanese flagship was dying. The sea became chaos, Japanese destroyers weaving through explosions, desperate to shield their crippled capital ship. Washington's secondary guns opened up, blasting smaller targets to splinters. South Dakota, regaining partial power, joined in the assault. Her forward turrets fired into the blinding flashes, each salvo hammering home with grim determination. For the Japanese, it was a nightmare. Their prized battlecruiser, symbol of imperial might, was being obliterated by unseen enemies firing through the dark with impossible accuracy. The confidence that had once defined their night-fighting doctrine collapsed in minutes. Sailors abandoned their guns, shouting commands drowned by explosions. Searchlights flickered out, and one by one, the Japanese guns fell silent. Kirishima listed heavily to port, her hull glowing from internal fires. A final salvo from Washington struck her magazine, sealing her fate. By 01:00 hours, the once-proud battlecruiser was mortally wounded. Her crew fought to save her, but the order was inevitable: abandon ship. As Kirishima sank beneath the waves, she carried with her hundreds of men and the myth of Japanese night supremacy. The Imperial Navy, so long dominant in the darkness, had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outthought. The American ships, battered but victorious, ceased fire. The echoes rolled across the sound, fading into the night. Fires burned across the sea, fragments of ships, oil slicks ignited by the fury of battle. For the survivors drifting in lifeboats, the glow was a haunting reminder of what modern war had become. Aboard South Dakota, the damage was severe but survivable. Her superstructure was shattered, dozens of men wounded or dead, but her engines still turned, and her flag still flew. The crew moved among twisted steel and wreckage, tending to the injured, counting the living. They had faced the worst and endured. For Admiral Lee and his task force, the battle was over. The Japanese had withdrawn, their surface fleet broken. Guadalcanal, that small, blood-soaked island, would remain in American hands. In just one night, radar, discipline, and the raw power of 2 American battleships had rewritten the story of naval warfare. But in the silence that followed, as the fires dimmed and the sea calmed, the men aboard South Dakota could still feel the tremors of what they had survived. The weight of every impact, every explosion, every scream carried by the wind. The battle had ended, but its echoes would live on in the memory of all who witnessed the night when steel met steel and the ocean itself burned. And in the days to come, the world would begin to understand what that victory meant, not just for Guadalcanal, but for the entire Pacific War. When the sun rose over Iron Bottom Sound on November 15, 1942, the Pacific lay eerily calm, as if exhausted by the fury of the night before. The acrid scent of burned oil drifted over the still waters, where twisted steel and drifting wreckage marked the grave of men and ships. Smoke curled upward from shattered hulls, faint and ghost-like, against the morning sky. The Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was over. USS South Dakota, scarred but afloat, steamed slowly out of the combat zone. Her hull bore 42 shell hits, her superstructure was torn and blackened, and several compartments were flooded. Power was unstable, her radar damaged, and communications partially dead. Yet she was alive and, more importantly, victorious. 90 men had been killed and 114 wounded. Fires burned in her upper decks, but her heart, the engines, the magazines, remained intact. Damage control teams, drenched in sweat and oil, worked in silence, sealing ruptured bulkheads and clearing the wounded. Nearby, the Washington maneuvered with quiet efficiency, her massive hull unscathed. Admiral Willis Lee's flagship had been the hand of retribution that ended the Japanese assault. The battle had cost the enemy dearly. The battleship Kirishima, once a proud veteran of Japan's navy, was gone, shattered and burning. 2 destroyers, Ayanami and a Sagumo, were left crippled or sinking. Nearly 1,400 Japanese sailors perished in those few hours. The Imperial Navy had been humiliated. For the surviving Japanese, the aftermath was confusion and disbelief. Many could not comprehend how the Americans had seen them in the dark. They had trusted their night-fighting prowess, a skill honed for decades, only to be undone by invisible eyes of radar. Sailors who escaped the inferno described the American salvos as walls of light, each shell glowing faintly as it screamed through the sky. One survivor of Kirishima later told interrogators that the explosions shook the sea like earthquakes. The sheer concussion from South Dakota's 16-inch guns crushed morale as effectively as they shattered armor. Those who had witnessed it firsthand said the sound of the American battleship's broadside was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Even miles away, the roar rolled through the air like thunder trapped in a canyon. To Japanese soldiers stationed on Guadalcanal's shores, the flashes on the horizon looked like lightning, only they did not fade. The blasts continued, steady and merciless, until the night itself seemed to burn. Many huddled in their foxholes, believing a fleet of dozens of ships was firing, not realizing it came from just 2. When the final echoes faded, silence carried a weight all its own. For the Japanese Navy, the loss of Kirishima and the destruction of the attack force ended their last serious attempt to dislodge the Americans from Guadalcanal. Admiral Mikawa's cruiser units retreated north, their faith in night superiority broken. Word spread across the Imperial fleet. American radar had turned the tide. Aboard South Dakota, the crew counted their dead. Bodies were carried gently below decks, tagged and wrapped in canvas. The men who remained stared across the wreck-strewn waters. Their expressions a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. They had survived one of the most chaotic naval battles in history and done their part in halting Japan's advance. In that moment, few realized they had just fought the engagement that would forever change the balance of naval warfare. The American Navy had proven that technology and discipline could overcome experience and aggression. The old era of night attacks and human intuition had met the cold, mathematical precision of radar-directed fire. And as the battered ships limped toward safety, the Pacific began to whisper of a new phase, one that would see the hunter become the hunted. The victory off Guadalcanal was more than a tactical triumph. It marked the end of Japan's offensive momentum in the Pacific. The Imperial Navy, once an unstoppable force stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific, began to lose its edge. The sinking of Hiroshima and the loss of seasoned sailors created a void that Japan could never refill. In contrast, the United States Navy, still bruised from earlier defeats, gained something far more powerful than territory: confidence. In Washington, D.C., intelligence briefings spoke of the battle in sober yet proud tones. For the first time, an American task force had met a Japanese fleet in darkness and prevailed. Analysts credited radar-directed gunnery and disciplined command coordination. Admiral Willis Lee's calm use of radar data was hailed as visionary. His ability to trust the instruments, rather than rely solely on human sight, symbolized a new age of naval warfare. Gone were the days of searchlights and optical rangefinders defining the night. The Pacific had become a battlefield of signals and electrons. For the U.S. Navy, the lessons of South Dakota's ordeal were immense. Damage control procedures were overhauled, communication redundancies were reinforced. The ship's electrical failure during the fight had nearly cost her life, and that vulnerability would shape future designs. Engineers studied every fragment of shrapnel embedded in her armor, every scorch mark left by near misses. Out of pain came progress. The psychological shift was just as significant. Until that point, Japan's sailors believed they alone held mastery of the sea at night, but after Guadalcanal, fear crept into the Imperial Navy's doctrine. Commanders became cautious. Ambitious night strikes were replaced with defensive maneuvers. Even Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, realized that the balance of innovation had turned against them. Japan's shipyards could build vessels, but they could not build radar systems fast enough to close the gap. Meanwhile, South Dakota returned to the U.S. mainland for repairs, arriving at New York Navy Yard to a hero welcome. Her battered superstructure became a symbol of endurance. Newspaper headlines called her Battleship X, a name that captured both secrecy and pride. The Navy kept details of her identity hidden to confuse the enemy and to give the American public a new icon of resilience. Crews from other ships visited her in dry dock, walking among the twisted metal and burn marks, learning firsthand what combat at close range truly looked like. For her crew, the war was not over. After months of restoration, South Dakota rejoined the Pacific Fleet, participating in later campaigns across the Marianas and the Philippines. Each time her guns roared, sailors remembered that night off Guadalcanal when chaos and courage fused into survival. Historians would later write that the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was the midnight turning point of the Pacific War. It denied Japan its last chance to recapture Henderson Field, ensuring the U.S. foothold on the island would endure. From that stronghold, American air power would expand relentlessly, paving the way for future victories at Tarawa, Saipan, and Leyte Gulf. But beyond strategy and steel, the battle left a quieter legacy, the birth of a new kind of sailor. One who trusted the unseen, who read radar screens as confidently as the horizon. One who understood that technology was not a replacement for bravery, but its extension. For the Japanese survivors, memories of that night would linger. Some later wrote that the flashes from South Dakota's guns haunted their dreams, not just for their power, but for what they symbolized. The moment Japan's naval supremacy began to crumble beneath the thunder of a single battleship's guns. As the Pacific campaign pushed westward, one truth had become clear. The fearsome roar of South Dakota's 16-inch guns had not merely broken ships. It had broken the illusion of invincibility. And in that fracture, the tide of war began to turn. In the grand story of the Pacific War, USS South Dakota, BB-57, stands as more than steel and rivets. She became a symbol of endurance, transformation, and the invisible courage that defined a generation. Her guns spoke not only through force, but through what they represented, the arrival of a new era in naval warfare. When her 16-inch shells thundered across Iron-Bottom Sound, they did more than destroy ships. They shattered an empire's confidence. In that black November night of 1942, the United States Navy, once reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, found its rhythm again. Amid smoke, confusion, and fire, a battered battleship proved that modern war belonged to those who could master both courage and technology. The South Dakota was not perfect. Her systems failed, her decks burned, her crew bled, yet through discipline and will she endured. And in that endurance lay the essence of America's wartime transformation, a shift from reaction to mastery, from learning to leading. Every rivet on her hull, every scar on her armor, became a lesson written in steel. For the men who served aboard her, the experience was seared into memory. They had faced the thunder of enemy guns and the terror of darkness, and answered with unity. Decades later, many spoke of that night not with pride alone, but with quiet reverence, aware that they had witnessed the birth of something far greater than victory, the moment the tide began to turn. South Dakota's story endures because it reminds us that even in war, progress is not born from perfection, but from survival. That night in Iron-Bottom Sound was not the end of Japan's power, but it was the beginning of the end. And as history moved forward, the echoes of her guns faded into legend, a reminder that in the darkest hours, the light of innovation and resolve can still find its mark across the sea. The thunder of her broadside became the heartbeat of a new Pacific, one that would never again belong to the rising sun.